This is the moment you've been waiting for. Months of writing and rewriting your perfect screenplay. Endless hours of watching audition tapes. Scouring your city for any local filmmakers to build your hardworking crew. You finally come to the first day of shooting your movie. You turn on your camera and it's dark. Like, too dark. You can't make out anything. Maybe you can fix it in camera, but you have no idea what any of these buttons mean. You absolute fool. You've thought of everything for this film except the one thing that'll actually bring your film to life. Your image. Without an image, there would be no movie. Nothing on screen at all, just total darkness. That's why today we're gonna break down the 5 elements of camera exposure. No matter what camera you use, you've gotta know these 5 elements and how to balance them together to get the best image for your shot. Now I want you to think about your camera like a thermometer. If it gets too hot, it might exceed its ability to actually read how hot it is. If it gets too cold, it might be too low for the thermometer to read anything. A camera, if it gets hit with too much light, will blow out and all we'll get is a totally white frame. If it's too dark, it'll be a totally black frame. What we want is to control the amount of light that hits the sensor in the camera so the information on our image is readable. Not too bright, not too dark. And we can control that amount of light with the 5 elements of camera exposure. So let's think about this step by step and work our way in. The first element is scene lighting. It's all the light that comes from your scene. You could use light from the sun, a lamp, or actual film lights. All that light bounces around your scene, some of it gets absorbed, and the rest heads towards your camera. On its way to the camera sensor, you can use filters in front of your lens. There are many different types of filters with different purposes, such as the Pro Mist filter that adds a dreamy bloom to the image, or a color filter, or simply a filter that limits the amount of light that passes through. In terms of controlling exposure, or getting that balance of light right, there are 2 we should know about: neutral density or ND filters, and polarizers. Neutral density filters are used to cut the amount of light on your image without changing any of the colors. Think of these filters like sunglasses. They cut the light entering your eyes, but the quality of what you're seeing stays the same. ND filters are measured by their density, so you'll see them labeled ND.3, ND.6, ND.9. Every 0.3 equals a cutting down of light by half. And so using an ND.3 filter will cut our light by half. Using an ND.6 will cut our light down to a fourth, and an ND.9 will cut it down by an eighth, and so on and so forth. We call every halving or doubling of light going up or down by a stop of light. Remember that term stop of light because it's a standard unit we use in filmmaking. And then you have polarizer filters, which you can use to cut refracted light. For example, if you're shooting outside and the sky is too bright, you can put on a polarizer, angle it right, and it should cut the exposure from the sky without changing anything else on screen. Back on our journey to the camera sensor, we now pass to our 3rd element, the aperture. The aperture is a controllable hole in your lens that light passes through. You can make it wider to allow more light to pass through the lens, or you can make it narrower, which cuts the amount of light, making your image darker. But beware that this will also affect how your image actually looks. Using a wider aperture will make your image brighter, but this also gives you a shallow depth of field, meaning that the range of distance from your lens that is in focus gets thinner. That makes it harder to keep your subjects in focus and makes everything outside that depth of field way blurrier. On the flip side, if you close your aperture down, you'll have a deeper depth of field, but your image will get darker. Remember that term stop of light? Well, we measure the aperture using f-stops, stands for focal stops. You'll probably notice this on your camera settings, f followed by a number. You can understand that number to be like the denominator in a fraction, and that fraction being analogous to how much of the lens opening surface area you're letting light through. The smaller the number of your f-stop, the larger your aperture actually is, and therefore, the more light that passes through it. As a final note, high-end cinema lenses will measure the aperture in t-stops, which stands for transmission stops. This is roughly equivalent to the f-stops, but with additional math to accommodate the light lost in the lens. Today's lenses are so high quality that the difference between f-stops and t-stops are minimal. Back on our journey to the sensor, we've passed through the aperture, and now we're going to hit the shutter, a door inside of the camera that flips open for a split second before closing down again. How long that door stays open to let light through is our 4th element, exposure time or shutter speed. These days, video cameras don't actually have a shutter anymore, and even photography cameras are getting rid of the shutter. Nonetheless, the term still exists. The shutter speed is measured in seconds, or rather fractions of a second. The slower your shutter speed, or the longer you expose your sensor, the brighter your image will be. However, this results in more motion blur because the time that your shutter is open is allowing more motion to be recorded in a single image. On the flip side, the quicker your shutter speed, or the less time you expose your sensor, the darker your image will be. This allows your action to be recorded more sharply and is used a lot for fight scenes in movies or sports. Finally, after this whole journey of bouncing off a scene, passing through your filter, your aperture, and your shutter, the light reaches the sensor. The last step is for the sensor to record the light energy. And so the final element of exposure is sensitivity to your sensor. This is measured in ISO, which stands for the International Standardization Organization that made the unit of measurement. If you boost your ISO, the sensor will have a higher sensitivity to light, making a brighter image. However, as you continue to boost your ISO, your image will become more grainy. At some point, your image can look unusable. All that grain is screwing up your skin tones or just being distracting in general. Thankfully, every generation of new cameras is improving on this. New cameras today can have usable footage all the way up to ISO 12,800 or even 16,000, which was unheard of a decade ago. This is great for filmmakers who might be shooting with natural light at night, like nature photographers or documentarians. Now, while you can adjust all these elements to get your exposure right, there's one problem. 3 of these elements are somewhat locked in. The standard aperture used in film and TV for most shots as a general rule is f2.8. If you shoot at an aperture wider or narrower than that, it would generally be apparent to the audience in a way you might not like. The depth of field could be too thin or the background could be too sharp. So in general, you're stuck around f2.8. The standard shutter speed for filmmaking is tied to your frame rate, and the rule of thumb is that your shutter speed should be half of your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, each frame could maximally be exposed at 1/24th of a second. Cut that in half, and you get 1/48th of a second. The reason we do this is because what we feel is the natural amount of motion blur in TV shows and movies today comes from how films have looked like since the beginning. And in the beginning, cameras had a spinning disc with a semicircle hole in it to control the shutter speed. And that hole would expose the film for half the time the film took to progress to the next frame. So if you change the shutter speed to anything outside that rule of thumb, you may be getting a level of motion blur that feels unnatural or distracting. And lastly, your ISO is also somewhat locked in, because each camera has a native ISO at which the sensor operates at best, giving you the most dynamic range between the darkest and brightest light information it can record. On our C100, for instance, the native ISO is 850. If I change from that ISO, I could be impacting the quality of my image. With those 3 generally locked in, all we have left is the first 2 elements, scene lighting and filters. If we want to maximize our filmmaking quality, we have to really maximize our ability to use those 2 elements, primarily scene lighting, which can be used to add and subtract light, whereas filters can only subtract light. We'll cover lighting in a few episodes. Thanks for watching this episode of NODEHAUS Film School. If you want downloadable resources, be sure to check out our Gumroad. If you want to join the conversation, join our Discord. And if you want more videos like this, always be sure to subscribe for more and hit the bell.